Welcome, everyone. Hope you enjoyed that little trailer and scary music. So, welcome to our very special Haunted Halloween edition of People Plus Places. I'm Adrian Scott Fine, I'm the Senior Director of Advocacy for the Los Angeles Conservancy. So, welcome. We're happy you're all here for a little special fun treat to look at people and places and Halloween and how they all come together. We're having a couple folks with us, but we want this to be an interactive, interesting, fun experience for you all. So, and also test a little bit about your knowledge of Los Angeles Halloween history. So let's just get started. I've got a question for you all that are tuning in, and please put it into the chat. What Los Angeles place played the fictional community of Haddonfield, Illinois, in John Carpenter's 1978 cult classic horror film Halloween? So please go ahead and put that into the chat. And at the same time, add where you're tuning in from, your neighborhood, your community, so we have a sense of like who's joining us today. So, People's Places, this is the ongoing series of the Conservancy where we shine the light on the nexus and connection between people and places and our organization's vision of connecting people to places and cultures. And so today we're again talking about how LA's historic built environment embodies the spirit of Hollywood, from celebrity cemeteries to spooky architecture to holiday traditions to pop culture horror house backdrops, from Halloween the movie to Freddy Krueger's house to Norman Bates' Psycho House. We're very fortunate and lucky to have all of these places in LA, whether they're real or imagined. And we want you to be part of this conversation. So again, we will have a Q&A later in the conversation. So to talk more about your favorite places or Halloween hunts throughout Los Angeles. But let's get started because we've got two special people joining us, two guests who, like me, just happen to love Halloween. And so soon you'll find out why. But let's welcome Karie Bible and Etan Rosenbloom. So go ahead, Karie and Etan, please turn your cameras and welcome. Happy to have you here. And let me give you a little bit of background, both of these great folks. Karie has been the tour guide at Hollywood Forever Cemetery since 2002. She's been featured on Turner Classic Movies, the History Channel, Travel Channel, and the PBS series World's Greatest Cemeteries. She's lectured at the Queen Mary Homestead Museum, Avalon Theater, and the Old Town Music Hall. You can find Karie and take one of her tours by going to Instagram or cemeterytour.com, or Instagram again at Cemetery Tour Guide. So please check it out if you haven't done one of those before. And then Etan Rosenbloom is a lifelong Angelino. He's a native. There are some of you out there. He's the founder of Etan Does L.A, a website and social media project documenting his visits to every single Los Angeles landmark on the National Register of Historic Places, no small feat. He's also a graduate of the LA Conservancy's most recent Community Leadership Bootcamp program, and he supports his history habit by working for an organization that gets songwriters and composers paid when their music is played. You can find Etan a couple places. Look for etandoesla.com or Instagram and other channels at Etan Does L.A. So again, welcome you both. Happy you're here joining us, and also everyone else that's here with us today and in the chat. And let's see, we're getting some responses to the question about Halloween in the community. Pasadena, yeah. So those that's not sure who answered it first, but yes, we're fortunate to be the stand-in for lots of horror films and houses and places, and that's part of it. So let's start with the first question. Why do you love Halloween? What is it about this holiday that you and so many others just can't get enough of?
I was actually born on Halloween night, which I know a lot of my life you just cannot make up, but it's true. So that's always been just a huge holiday for me. And growing up, it was a really creative time. My mom and dad would make my brother and I these terrific costumes, and we'd go to carnivals and we'd do stuff as a family. So I have such like fantastic memories of Halloween growing up, and it's always been like one of my favorite holidays.
I really love the community aspect of it. First of all, it's like there might be neighbors who pass you by without saying a word for the rest of the months out of the year, but in October, they look over and, see the giant spider web and the spider crawling down. They're like, nice job this year. I think you're win an award for that in the neighborhood Halloween spook off. And it's an easy conversation starter. I also love Halloween because it's an opportunity to let your freak flag fly as high as you want it. Get outside yourself, try on different ideas. It's like, it's not just okay to be weird, it's almost mandated culturally that you're going to test something else out.
Yeah, I think I feel the same way about you on that too. I mean, it's the one holiday where you can just have fun. Not that the other holidays aren't fun, but
There's a lot of work
there's a
involved.
lot of work. But speaking personally, it's the one holiday where it's all about being creative, stepping out of your box, literally, maybe into a box, whatever you want to do, in terms of costumes and design. I also love this holiday because it reminds me of my mom, because she used to design all of our costumes for us as kids. Including when I went to Halloween as a haunted house itself. So, which I may show you a picture of later. But yeah, I think that's part of the reason why it's a fun holiday, and there's candy involved. So what can you not like about that? Okay, so a couple questions I have for you, or a lot of questions I have for both of you, because you guys, well, anyway. When we're talking about people plus places, it's all about the idea that, you can't talk about a place without talking about the people involved with it. And that's how I think about Halloween, that it's inextricably linked to physical places. So it's haunted houses, there's ghost people or spirits, cemeteries. It's all about the people that are there now and their stories. And Karie, you know that better than any of us. And also this idea that spooky places, spaces evoke a mood, a feel, and just an experience. So what places in LA come to mind when you think of Halloween?
Well, for me, there's some really obvious ones. First, like all those old Victorian houses on the 1300 block of Carroll Avenue. I think we have a picture of me in front of one of them.
We do. So just 1 second and we're pulling it up. Keep going.
Yeah, so it's this yeah, there it is. So this was the house that the Michael Jackson Thriller video was shot in front of, and it's one of a huge concentration of old Victorians on Carroll Avenue in Angelino Heights, one of the first suburbs in LA. And it's just a beautifully preserved street. So that's one of them. And I know we're going to talk more about Victorians later. There's all those witchy storybook houses that are kind of dotted all over Los Angeles that look like hobbits or dwarves or witches or Baba Yaga or whatever the witch character in your culture is. And then okay, there's a good example of one, the Spadena house in Beverly Hills.
Let's make a comeback. I think this needs to make a comeback.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Bring them back, please.
Let's do away with the square box Apple store thing and witch's house.
The more misshapen the roof, the better, for sure.
And this is also a great story of preservation, that this house very easily could have been a tear down. It's in Beverly Hills, where the land is very valuable, and someone stepped up and bought it when the right time and invested in it, and now it's a beloved place for everybody to go and see during Halloween or any time of the year. So
absolutely. And it's got like an incredible connection to Hollywood too, of course. Like it used to be on the lot of a studio in Culver City. It was like the offices and the dressing rooms for a studio out there before it was moved to Beverly Hills. I did want to bring up one thing that I think of when I think of Halloween. And, we talk a lot about scary houses and cemeteries and, of course, the traditionally spooky things. But I also think Halloween is a great time to think about neighborhoods and how they're set up. Just your average run-of-the-mill neighborhood. The ones I used to trick or treat around in Altadena and Hastings Ranch, around where I grew up. I had never seen houses that big as the ones in Hastings Ranch where some of my friends lived. And so it provided almost like an architectural tour for me back before I knew I cared about architecture. You know, you get to compare houses, and depending on how wide your neighbor like opens the door, maybe you can sort of poke your head around and look at what they got hiding in there.
What about you, Karie? What is it for you?
Well, aside from
Places.
cemeteries, which is kind of an obvious answer for me, I love the Heritage Square Museum off the 110 freeway. Every year they do like a Victorian morning event, which this usually they do a Saturday where they maybe recreate a Victorian funeral. Every year there's a theme. I learn every single year at that event something. It's fascinating stuff. And then usually the Sunday they do like more of a family friendly kid type of event. But I love those homes. I love that street. I love the way that they've done such incredible preservation there. And they try to constantly have activities and events to kind of educate people about these houses, about this history, about this part of Los Angeles. So Heritage Square is like a really favorite spot for me.
Yeah, I'm going to share, since you both brought up Victorian architecture, maybe it's a little tangent, but we are blessed. Although we don't have as much as most cities, certainly San Francisco and other cities, and we used to have a lot more. Bunker Hill, as we all know, that was really where the Victorian architecture of Los Angeles once was. But we have things like, you know, Angelino Heights, and as you're talking about, Heritage Square, so places like this, and including, oops, it's coming back. Well, it'll be back. Charmed House, there it is. Also in Angelino Heights. So what is it about this architecture that you both said gravitate towards in terms of this this holiday?
I don't know why this is, but I think a lot of people associate Victorian anything with spookiness. We were talking about before we went live. I went down to up to Reign of Terror in Thousand Oaks last weekend, the haunt, and a huge section of that haunt was recreated Victorian. And I kind of was walking through going, wow, they're not doing Spanish Revival or, you know, Craftsman haunt. They're doing a Victorian type haunt. So there's something kind of macabre or creepy or, I don't know, interesting about that particular style of architecture, the detail, the ornateness, the furniture, just so many things that are really interesting about it.
Yeah, I totally agree. You know, there is something that seems almost intangibly spooky about Victorian architecture. And it was kind of a brain teaser for me to think about what structurally in the Victorian style communicates, you know, when you go past it or you walk inside it. I think part of it is that Victorians tended to be divided up into a bunch of small compartmentalized rooms, each with its specific purpose and sort of disconnected with the rest of them. So it's kind of the opposite of the open plan that you see in a lot of more modern houses. And so there's that sense of confinement that's already built into it. But then you add in the fact that, you know, classic Victorians are also stuffed to the gills with tapestries and vases and all kinds of antiques that you had to be careful not to touch. And at the time, like maybe some of the women were wearing much floofier dresses and had to be even more careful about not knocking things over. So already there's this almost this sense of stasis, you know. It's also, there wasn't a lot of light inside there. So it's like, whether you're talking about stained glass windows that don't let as much natural light in, or you know, electricity wasn't really a thing in homes until the 1920s or so. And so when Victorians had their heyday, you had these gas lamps which emitted much less light than electrical lights, but also, you know, you would get like soot over the years just sort of darkening the walls, you know. I've even heard some conjecture that, you know, the fumes from the gas lamps might help people hallucinate and see ghosts where they didn't exist. I don't know if that can be proved.
Someone in the comments mentioned the Lizzie Borden bed and breakfast.
Yeah.
I've actually been there. I stayed there the Christmas before last with my dear friend Jenny, Etan's cousin. And some of my friends said I was insane to spend the night in the Lizzie Borden house, but I did. And it was fascinating too. So yeah, another example of why maybe people associate Victorian with the claustrophobia, with maybe even crime.
Yeah,
Yes.
I think there's also something about when you see Victorians being used in film, at the time that Hollywood comes around in the golden age, it's 40, 50 years after Victorians have their heyday, right?
Mhm.
So by that time, a lot of these Victorians have fallen into disrepair. They can be really expensive and difficult to maintain. And maybe some of them that were built later on, like, weren't that well built. So you have wooden eaves that are sagging, and you have like, less than A-level plumbing that now sounds clanky, and you might hear weird noises coming just from that if you're staying inside at night. So that all contributes to the spookiness.
Yeah, and a lot of our people joining us are very much with you on that. So Gary, you're right on target with what Etan is saying. And it also, again, speaks to preservation. In the 40s, 50s, 60s, Victorian architecture was completely out of favor. It was dilapidated, or it wasn't, in many cases, it wasn't being maintained in the way it was before. And it was seen as kind of dark and dated and old-fashioned. And so it was a perfect backdrop, certainly for the film noir, for sure. In LA, you can point to many films that really relied on that device, kind of that scary Victorian house, to kind of really play up that. But certainly, and then we lost a lot of it. So we're happy to have what we have. And now people look at Victorian, hopefully in a little different way, not just as scary. But we're going to tease on that a little bit more in terms of architecture, and I especially want to get into Second Empire, because that's another architectural device that has been very much linked to the haunted, scary house. So my next question for you both is, architecture and the built environment have been the backdrop to scary stories for generations in popular culture. What are some of the places and styles of architecture that you think are particularly fitting for this?
Well, tonight, actually, TCM is kicking off a late night with Vincent Price, and of course, the Ennis Brown house, which was used for House on Haunted Hill. And as the documentary Los Angeles Plays itself talks about, like, a lot of times this offbeat or unusual architecture was where the villain in the story lived. For some reason, that kind of became a trope. And so I always think about the Ennis Brown house as being a terrific, spooky location that is definitely not Victorian.
Yeah, oh yeah, far from it. And but there is definitely something, even just looking at these photos right here, if you don't know anything more about it, it looks monolithic, it looks otherworldly, it looks ancient. And I mean, certainly the inspiration for it was like Mayan architecture from the Yucatan area, in Mesoamerica. And I think this was a time in the 1920s where, like, a lot of architects, especially in Southern California, were looking beyond the traditional European inspirations for new styles of architecture, including some that they would try to call like even more American than, colonial revival or whatever. So in Southern California, there are a lot of architects looking to not just the Spanish colonial past, but even further to the pre-Columbian architecture of, the Mayans. Frank Lloyd Wright, who designed the Ennis House, and Robert Stacey Judd, who designed the Aztec Hotel that you're looking at right now. They both really loved Mayan stuff, and specifically like a lot of the temples and the palaces that were built like around Tikal and other places in the Yucatan. And Frank Lloyd Wright himself, he had been to the Chicago World's Fair in 1893, where there were actual plaster casts of some of these temples that archaeologists had uncovered. So fast forward 30 years to the early 1920s, and he finally gets his chance to build 4 houses in this Mayan revival style. And I think there's something fascinating about it, but it's also like they're all constructed out of these cubes with these almost hieroglyphic looking patterns in them. They look monumental, they look huge. I don't think that they look that comfortable. And you know, some of the owners of these houses did describe them as kind of cold. Spatially, they seem like Frank Lloyd Wright houses, but visually, they look kind of freaky and imposing and both ancient and futuristic, which is why it works so well for Blade Runner too.
We look at Karie, you brought up House on Haunted Hill, classic film, and it's interesting. This was the poster for the film. Clearly, did not use the Ennis house as part of it. It's certainly an older, looks sort of Second Empire-ish. It's hard to tell exactly what architectural style it was using here to evoke again the scary house on the hill. So first of all, one question for our audience. Please put in the chat, what year was this film? So I'd be curious who can land on the date. But then you look at the actual house, and you were talking about this, Etan, in terms of, you know, Frank Lloyd Wright. This was the epic of, you know, modern, really, at its time, but it still had this commanding sort of scary presence about it. Still does today, actually, when you drive up here, especially from this view, in terms of that. So I would also encourage you, the audience, to check out, and I'm not going to get the book right, but Chris Madrid French has done a whole book looking specifically at this idea of the villain's lair and around Hitchcock films. Not that he used the Ennis house, but he certainly used other types of architecture to kind of really evoke that idea. And I think that's part of what we're talking about here. And certainly when you look at some of the interior spaces of this house, it really does speak to that as well. What about Second Empire? Can we dig in on that? We have to dig on that a little bit. So things like Bates Mansion, the Addams Family, the Munsters, you know, you can go on and on and on about that particular architecture itself. So what is it about that, do you think? It's Victorian, but it's its own unique flavor, Victorian. And I've got some images I can throw up as we're kind of talking about this.
So to me, I know less about Second Empire homes, but the sort of canonical examples that I've seen, they tend to be more symmetrical than your average Victorian. There is this a big emphasis on height, first of all. So yeah, you know, look at that big middle section. So they're monumental, they're imposing. They have these eaves that overhang and almost add like, they almost look like a furrowed brow, you know, on the house. But also Second Empire houses tend to have windows in pairs. And so just visually, it looks like eyes, you know, glowering down at you. And, you know, I know this cartoon is sort of a caricature, but a lot of Second Empires did have all that stuff going for them.
To me, Second Empire, you know how in fashion they might say, oh, you have a statement piece if you're wearing a really bold bracelet necklace or something like that. To me, the Second Empire, that's the statement piece of like personal architecture, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right.
It definitely makes a statement.
It definitely makes a statement in terms of that. And I think it's the mansard roof that either you love it or you hate it, but it is classic to this period of architecture, and certainly it's the defining feature. But it is, I think, speaks to some of what you're talking about, and certainly it's the perfect place for our favorite characters to live. I could quiz you on all of their names, but I'm sure you all have them by heart in terms of each of the characters here. And then it gets to things like Psycho as well, which, you know, it's not a real house, but again, very much building off this kind of trope of the Second Empire architecture. And I think this speaks very clearly, kind of the eyes. And again, it's almost like it has a presence of its own in terms of the architecture itself. So, okay.
It is interesting thinking about like how just a roof itself can give you such a different vibe. Or, you know, you compare that very steep mansard with like the Ennis house, and he was famous for like exclusively using flat roofs. And it's imposing in its own way, just use very different techniques and, you know, just masses to make the Ennis house imposing. Whereas like for that Bates house, it just looks like it has this iron cap of doom, you know?
Yeah. Can so Etan, you started talking a little bit about other styles like the Aztec. What about Egyptian revival? Because that style is, I mean, it's rooted in death. In terms of it became very popular after the discovery of King Tut's tomb, and you saw it in this kind of fantasy approaches from theaters to apartment buildings to, you know, individual houses, and we have some of that scattered around Los Angeles. So what do you think about that in terms of when we talk about kind of scary architecture, if that's such a thing?
I mean, I think you pretty much said it already. It's like it starts as just a general curiosity because of what was happening archaeologically in the 1920s, and then becomes I almost think of Egyptian revival and Mayan revival as costumes for houses, you know? It's a purely aesthetic concern for most of the architects that were doing stuff in the 20s. You know, there's probably very few people that are going to go to the Egyptian theater when it reopens. It's just about to reopen, right?
November 9th.
Yeah, that's awesome. Who, you know, have some kind of religious connection to it. But, you know, our knowledge of Egyptian funerary customs and how their gods tie into mythologies and all of that certainly helps fill in some of the I guess the imaginary gaps that we have. And so these interpretations of Egyptian architecture that we see are almost a way of accessing the imagination. And a lot of what we know about Egyptian customs are about like how they buried their dead. You know, the death was a huge part of the life cycle in ancient Egypt. So whether it's, you know, pyramids or tombs or King Tut or mummies or anything like that, a lot of what we know about Egyptian life, or a lot of what is taught about Egyptian life, is really about Egyptian death.
And we have a lot of Egyptian influenced Art Deco revival at Hollywood Forever. We have several beautiful examples of that are from the 20s and 30s. And even if last weekend I did a special unique tour focusing on Norma Shearer, and we went into the very end of the Jewish mausoleum where Joseph's child crowd is. And I couldn't believe my eyes. There was this gorgeous, like King Tut urn in there that was so pretty. So there's lots of examples of that peppered all over the place. And Nathan Marsack, my colleague and friend in the Art Deco Society, he collects vintage embalming bottles. And believe it or not, some of them have pyramid shapes from the 20s and 30s. So you kind of see that the King Tut influence and the Egyptian influence was in movies and music and fashion and sheet music and architecture and cemetery funerary things. So it's kind of fun to notice how pervasive. And I think too, not only is it about death, but there's something kind of glamorous and exotic about it to me, you know, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who felt that way.
Well, speaking of glamorous and exotic, and we'd be remiss of not mentioning or bringing up, or at least showing you, the Soden house, which is all the things you just said. It's a little deco, it's a little Mayan, it's a little exotic, it creates a mood, a feeling, and then it has a whole alleged backstory attached to the house too, which we won't necessarily get into, but you know, it's one of those places that definitely evokes a feeling, whether you're in the interior courtyard like this or even on the, you know, outside looking up, sometimes referred to as the Jaws house, for a whole nother aspect in terms of that. But yeah, I think that's part of this. Go ahead.
A lot of people call it the Jaws house for sure. Do we have that clip of my family at the Spadena house that we can pull
We
up?
do. One second. Oh, you're right. We do.
Happy Halloween, everybody. This is Etan and her. We're standing outside the Spadena house. Wow. Hey, what do you think that looks like?
with an eyeball and a bat and a mouth.
That's a lot of stuff. Yes, I saw the exact same thing.
So a shark with an eyeball and a bat in its mouth. Yeah, so interpret it that way, or a Jaws. It definitely has that fearsome look from the front. And I also love the fact that, you know, that's designed by Lloyd Wright, it's Frank Lloyd Wright's son, and he was the construction engineer or construction supervisor for I think all or maybe 3 out of the 4 of the Mayan revival houses that Frank Lloyd Wright designed. But he was actually the one that introduced the idea of the prefabricated textile block to his dad. And there's a house on Ogden Street in Hollywood that I think has the first example of that construction technique.
It's also, there's another connection to preservation, so we always keep bringing it back. The Spadena house is one of the Conservancy's conservation easement properties, so it is protected in perpetuity, and we ensure that, you know, even if it changes hands or has new owners, it always has protection and design review process in place. So
you've got another one, the Freeman house, right? The Freeman house, there's an easement on that one too, right?
There is, and the Ennis house. So yeah, there's a number of these in terms of having this type of higher level of protection. Karie, you mentioned already a little bit about Hollywood Forever and the amazing things that are there that you've been showing people. So you've been doing this for a lot of years. What led you to, you know, launch this as part of your identity now in terms of the cemetery lady?
Good question. Well, growing up, my brother and I lived around the corner from my family, from a cemetery. So my brother and I would ride our bikes in it. I mean, from like babyhood until I left for college, I was around the corner from a cemetery, and being around one was never bizarre, creepy, unusual. It was none of those things. It was very normal for me. And I went to film school. I got a degree in film. And as a little kid, my parents, we did a lot of family vacations that were involving the Civil War and historic sites. And we'd go to houses and cemeteries and battlefields and things. And when I'd see the living history people all dressed up, no matter how hot it was in Mississippi or South Carolina or wherever we were, it really kind of made a huge impression on me. This is a long explanation, but I also fell in love with classic Hollywood as a little girl. My gateway drug was Bela Lugosi and Dracula. So I never lost this passion for cemeteries and history and film. And when I first moved to Hollywood permanently in the year 2000, I saw Hollywood Forever and just fell completely in love, as I think everybody does who visits. And I asked around if they had a tour, and I heard they did not. And I thought, well, maybe I could do it. So Mark Wanamaker has been a really incredible mentor and historian to me. So he introduced me to Tyler Cassidy, who's the president of the cemetery. I met with him. Mark Wanamaker helped me kind of put the initial tour together. And I've been doing that since February of 2002. And I think the thing that gives me the most joy about what I do is helping these artists live on, because there's so much Los Angeles history, film history. And I just hope that people will take my tour and then look up these people, read about them, watch their movies, find out what they did with their lives. And to be able to tell those stories and share that history that's one of the things that gets me out of bed every day.
Can I ask, so a lot of people have done these tours and more people should be doing your tours, but what is some of the things that are people most surprised about after going on one of your tours, or that they learn about that they had no idea that existed there?
I think a lot of people are surprised John Huston has such a humble marker, because it's just a rectangle on the ground and this huge bush is kind of obscuring it. People always say, well, he's this Oscar-winning film legend. Why doesn't he have this huge monument, this huge mausoleum? And my explanation is, look, nothing is ever as it seems in Hollywood. So just because he was that doesn't mean he's going to have a huge marker. And I think people are surprised at how big it is too, because from the street, you just see Lucy's Laundry, Craig and Otto parts, the tire shop, you see about that much. And then when people walk inside, they're just kind of blown away by the the beauty of it and by the size of it.
And what about the idea of a cemetery as either a static place that is like frozen in time versus a place that is constantly evolving and changing and maybe growing and expanding? Because that is part of the dynamic with a cemetery.
Yeah, I mean, every time I go on a vacation, I come back and I'm like, oh, that wasn't there last week. Oh my, so it's kind of got to be by definition a constantly changing thing, unless it's full and closed down, because I kind of use the analogy. It's like owning an apartment building where people don't move out, but you got to keep having new apartments and paying the bills. So it's not unlike that. It's the drumbeat of death marches on. So you've got to find new ways to inter people, new ways to remember them with statues or markers. And it almost evolves on a daily basis. I mean, I do my tour usually once a week, but right now several times because it's Halloween time. But every time I'm there, I notice something new I didn't notice before. So it is a constantly evolving thing. According to Tyler, I think we have about 50 years of ground space, and when that's gone, it's gone. So
Wow.
we are building right now a brand new mausoleum that is going to be the tallest one in America, and it's going to hold 30,000 crypts. And I showed it to Etan last week, and it's really going to be spectacular. It's going to have viewing platforms on the top with sweeping views of Los Angeles, and it's supposed to open either late 2023 or early 2024.
Wow, I look forward to checking that out. And then just to follow up, I asked everyone to kind of name the year for House on Haunted Hill. I saw some dates in there. It's 1959, just so you know. Vincent Price, check it out. It's a classic. So let's dig a little deeper on this idea of cemeteries. So for both of you, places traditionally associated with the dead, again, from cemeteries to funeral homes. There's another aspect that doesn't get talked about, and this idea that inherently a lot of them were segregated by society in terms of how they developed, where they were located in a community. So you have Jewish cemeteries, you have historically Black cemeteries, you have cemeteries that only the affluent could really afford to be in. And the same goes for funeral homes. So these places were the result of different traditions, discrimination, and this basic idea of you literally limiting access of who goes where or who's allowed to go where. So how do we reckon with that concept today when we're talking about telling full stories and being inclusive and ensuring that people understand kind of like why do we have cemeteries in different parts of the city, and why do they look the different ways?
Well, there's the well-known story that Hattie McDaniel, as she was dying, she wanted to be at what is now called Hollywood Forever. And the former owner, Jules Roth, at that time was racist and told her family no. So she was interred at Angela's Rosedale. But when our current owner, Tyler, took over, he obviously realized this was a terrible injustice. He contacted the family and he wanted to disinter her from Rosedale, rebury her at Hollywood Forever, all expenses paid. The McDaniel family didn't want to do that. And I have talked to many people in the death care business that have said disinterment can potentially be very traumatic for families. So they declined, but Tyler said, look, this was a terrible injustice and we need to make this right. So we have a beautiful pink marble marker right beside the pond, probably the best piece of waterfront property the cemetery has. And it has been put there to honor Hattie McDaniel's last wish.
That's sweet.
I took Karie's tour just a couple of weeks ago, actually. And one of the things that I love the most about it is that, Karie knows a lot about all the celebrities and entertainment industry adjacent folks that are buried there, and she shows them all to you. But she also shows you the future burial plot of an old gay couple and a famous trans performance artist who was like one of Andy Warhol's muse, and shows you the Hattie McDaniel cenotaph. And you really get the sense that this cemetery, is the final resting place for the entire spectrum of the human experience. It's changed over time for sure, but it's more than just famous people that are here. I think if you look at that theme more largely, it's like every culture has its own way of taking care of its dead and its own unique perspective on death. And even in segregated spaces, you can see those traditions coming forward. And one of the most moving examples to me is the Angelus Funeral Home in South LA. So this company was formed in 1922 at a time when restrictive housing covenants were preventing non-white people from living in lots of different parts of Los Angeles. And that wasn't struck down until the late 40s, I think. There's a Supreme Court case, Shelley versus Kramer. And so at that time, a large percentage of LA's Black population was boxed into this strip around Central Avenue in South LA. And a lot of white-owned mortuaries wouldn't even accept their business, wouldn't let Black people be buried at white cemeteries. So they had to develop a business to serve their own. By the 1930s, just a decade after it was founded, Angelus Funeral Home was like the most successful Black-owned business in Los Angeles. I saw the owners described as morticians of distinction by a newspaper at the time. And they commissioned the great architect Paul R. Williams to design them a headquarters. You're looking at it right now. And then when they outgrew that headquarters in the 60s, they had Williams design their next headquarters on Crenshaw, which I think was just on the screen before. Yeah, there you go. I mean, talk about Egyptian revival. That kind of looks like the entrance to an Egyptian palace to me. And it was vacant. The original building was vacant for a few decades, but then it was adaptively reused as an affordable housing complex. I think it was 2019 that it reopened. And of course, they called it the Paul R. Williams Apartments. So to me, that's an example of a business that was born out of trauma, it was born out of segregation, and ended up being a real point of pride for the Black community. And one fun fact there that actually connects to the story that Karie was saying, in 1993, the Angelus Funeral Home bought the Rosedale Cemetery in West Adams, and that's where Hattie McDaniel was and still is buried. So all kind of comes full circle.
Everything's connected. I would also throw out, in addition to Angelus Funeral Home, another Pierce Brothers Funeral Home, which was another kind of very early funeral home and catered to the stars and affluent. And it has had an interesting history over time, but after a series of fires and vacancies, it was rehabilitated, and it's also serving as affordable, I believe, senior housing as well. So again, preservation and places and people all comes together in terms of this. I would also throw out that it's interesting that I think of cemeteries as like places for, yes, it's places for those that have passed, but it's also very much for places that for people that are living to go to. So they're often beautifully designed places. I know my mom grew up going to cemeteries and having picnics. And that seemed like a totally normal thing to do because there would be bucolic, there were ponds and things like that. And like, why don't we do that more? And certainly Hollywood Forever is one of the most beautiful landscapes in LA. Is there anything wrong about going there and having a picnic or just hanging out?
I don't think so. As long as you're respectful and clean up your picnic and don't just leave it all over the ground. I think that it's very much a place about life as much as it is a place about death and remembrance.
I also think about like Jewish cemeteries in this kind of concept that it's less that you bring flowers to honor the dead, but you bring the rock. And it's a way of acknowledging, that one, you were there and people see that, but it's a little more concrete way of kind of, again, connecting the living with the dead in terms of this. So, okay, Etan, I've got a question for you. So you do LA. So what places have you personally found to be scary?
Man, there are so many of them, and I was trying to put together a list, but also think about what makes these places spooky that I find spooky. So I encountered this idea in this book, actually. It's called Ghostland by an author named Colin Dickey, and I highly recommend it. The book is all about what places that are considered haunted tell us about ourselves, tell us about American history, that kind of thing. And one of the ideas that he talks about is a Freudian concept of the unheimlich. I have no idea if I pronounced that right, but it's translated roughly as uncanny or unhomelike. It's this sense that you're in a place that was once full of life and purpose, but now has like the barest traces of what they used to be and who used to use them. So, you know, a haunted house could be an example of that, where you walk in and, you know, you see these chairs sitting around and the rug where the kids used to play, but there's nothing there. It's just a layer of dust. And so there's only this like weird, vague sense of the house as being used in a house-like manner. So all that said, I'm most freaked out by like abandoned and disused places. Those really give me the willies. So a couple examples that I could point to. First, the Sears in Boyle Heights, which hasn't been used in decades, and it's just been going through like development hell for a long time. I know it has a new owner as a couple of years ago, but it's such a massive complex. It's hard to imagine what you could do with it. You know, affordable housing, like, of course, that makes a lot of sense, but it's such a massive complex. Like, how would you rehab it and make sure that it's like economically sensible? So do we have a picture of that Sears in Boyle Heights from a couple of years ago? Yeah, there we go. So that's the one. That's from, I want to say, late 2021. And, you know, this was an entrance that people used to go to on the weekends and like buy toys and clothes, and you could buy all kinds of stuff. But this was a massive building. It was one of the few remaining like shipping centers for an entire region. So like if you were in Hawaii and wanted to order pants from Sears, the pants would come from here. But now it's all boarded up and there are windows missing. And, you know, especially on this day, there was like this sort of like overcast look in the sky, and it freaked me out. Another one I would point to is Rockhaven Sanitarium. And it was one of the first and only woman-owned and woman-run sanitaria for the care of women. And it was the early 20th century. It's really an amazing idea, an amazing history, and an amazing woman who ran it. And still the people, the Friends of Rockhaven, are doing great work trying to get this place rehabbed. So it's worth a tour. You can still take tours. I think they do one maybe monthly. But you go in there and it has all these sort of cottages. And a lot of them are run down and the landscaping is overgrown. At one time, this place won awards for like how gorgeous its landscaping was, but now everything looks kind of craggy. And they had secured a bunch of money from a state senator a few years ago to get it fixed up, and it just hasn't happened yet. So I don't know what the status is right now. Someone is saying that Rockhaven is closed to all right now. Well, I visited it maybe a year ago, and they still have a lot of the old stuff from some of the residents that were there when it closed down. And so you could call it a state of like arrested decay, you know, but you look, there are toys, there are chairs, there's like a television that's just sort of like sitting there in a room. And, you know, that it's creepy and also worth saving, but definitely
creeped me out. We were talking about people and places, and sometimes if a place maybe isn't inherently creepy, but you know the backstory, then it becomes that.
Mhm.
And I love Greystone Manor, and I have a very vivid imagination. So whenever I've been in there, I can just, you know, imagine things that happened in there in my mind. And of course, as I'm sure many of you know, it's the spot of the very famous Doheny Walter Plunkett murder-suicide. And every time I've been there, and I've been all through the house too, that I think about that and I always feel this sadness, and maybe even this kind of sense of emptiness when I'm there. And I don't know that I would feel that way if I didn't know the story, but because I do, I feel that way, you know? And a few years back, I got to go to the Lincoln Heights jail, which was abandoned. Oh my God, there's like a wall of flies when you go in, and it was just filthy. And my imagination ran wild because I got to see one of the interrogation rooms. And I kept thinking, I bet so many people were beaten in this room. You can just almost feel like the grit, the dirt, the sweat, the desperation just calling to you from the walls of that place.
No, I think that's a great point. And I mean, you know, prisons are a good example of spaces where we know something has happened there that sort of engages with our darkest fears, you know, crime, but also like mass incarceration and maybe like improper treatment. And, you know, that connects with the sanitarium idea too. It's like Rockhaven was almost an oasis where it's laid out architecturally to feel like a home, like peaceful, but sanitaria weren't always like that. You know, they were more like prisons for a large part of American history. But yeah, I think that idea of a spooky place also holding memories or like stories of loss, that it's exactly what you're talking about, Karie, that the more you know about a place, the sadder it might feel. So definitely Greystone. I feel that way about the missions, in particular the mission St. Gabriel Archangel, which I revisited recently. They just reopened in July after the fire, of vandal or an arsonist set a fire during the pandemic. And it's like, it's immaculate, and it's peaceful, and there's so much history there. I mean, that building was from like 6 years before LA became a city. But there's also this sense that like there were thousands of indigenous people that are buried here, and many more that that died, you know, while they were living there or working there. And so you can't avoid this weight of it. And, you know, I'll say to their credit, they just reopened a new museum that does a much better job than before of like acknowledging that history. And it's definitely worth visiting. But, you know, it's a heavy and very important place.
Yeah, I mean, everything both of you are speaking about are places have stories to tell, and some of them they're difficult histories or narratives, but we learn from those, and then if we know them, we understand that place in a more profound way, especially the connection to the people that are associated with that particular place. And many of the sites that you're mentioning are really preservation issues. Certainly Lincoln Heights Jail, there's proposal to have it demolished. We don't want that. We want to see it reused and figure out how it can be contributing to the community of Lincoln Heights, and also ensure that that story is told because we learn from it. Or Sears, there's been proposal to adapt it for housing. How great would that be in terms of providing a critical mass of housing, but also reusing that building? Or General Hospital, I saw was mentioned in the chat, and others. So, and Rockhaven has been a long time preservation challenge in Glendale in terms of figuring out how do you adaptively reuse that building or that complex of buildings, really, to ensure again that it's functioning and useful today, but still telling the stories of the past. Amazingly, we are down to our last 4 or 5 minutes. I don't know how that happened.
Fast.
I know. So I'm going to encourage everyone, any last minute questions you have for Karie, Etan, or us at the Conservancy, please put them in the chat. I'm going to share my screen for a couple of things. I know, Karie, you've already mentioned some things, and Etan, things that are going on during this Hollywood season, or Halloween season. I guess it is Hollywood, Halloween. They're all kind of one and the same in many ways. But there's also other things that you can be doing to see people, places, and Halloween places as part of this. So Fort LA, if you're not familiar with them, it's a great organization, nonprofit, Friends of Residential Treasures, Fort, Los Angeles, which they curate lots of tours across the city, but this is one that they do, which house number 4, looking at towers and turrets. And this is just a close-up of their trail that they do, but it's tells you all about different places to check out, tour, and gives you the backstory in terms of that. So I'd encourage you to check that out, as well as any of their other tours. It's a great resource. And then if my screen advances, there's also an opportunity to go to San Pedro and go to the the Grand Theater there. I'm blanking on the full name of it right now, but
Warner Grand, right?
Warner Grand, thank you so much. Which they are showing Frankenstein, which was produced in 1931 with Boris Karloff. And it's also the same year that that amazing Art Deco historic theater was built. So there's an opportunity to check out. Again, my screen is just shot in terms of frozen, but it'll come back. But it's an opportunity to check out that movie. There is a discount for Conservancy members, supporters, if you'd like to check that out in terms of that. And please go ahead and do that. So there's lots of other things. What else am I missing, Karie and Etan, in terms of things that people can be doing or you highly recommend that they should check out before Halloween is over?
I would recommend the Angel of Light. It's a very interactive, immersive haunt. It is pricey, I admit, but I felt like I got my money's worth. And it was interesting to see how they utilized the historic 1930 Los Angeles movie palace. And we talked about haunts being kind of set in Victorian times. This is a haunt set in Art Deco times. And they use the backstage, the dressing rooms, the mezzanine downstairs, the nursery for kids, and it's so well done. And also the LA Opera is playing To Bride of Frankenstein at the United Artists Theater / Ace Hotel also this weekend. This weekend I think too.
Great.
I mean, I was going to bring up the witch houses that Fort LA does. My daughter and I were just visited a couple of them this past weekend. They have this Instagram filter too, where you can take a video and it'll automatically add green skin, a witch's hat, and a little black cat licking itself next to you. I have an example of it on my Instagram page, Etan Does L.A, if you're curious. Are they, Karie, earlier you mentioned Heritage Square. Do they still have that Cemetery Lane thing going?
I don't think they're doing it this year, but they have done it in the past. And I think their Victorian morning event was the weekend before last. There's so much going on right now. It's kind of mind blowing, but they do a wonderful Christmas event. There's always stuff going on there. And that museum is a really great place to support.
And here it is. It's also in the chat. So here's the link for the Frankenstein Alive in concert at the Warner Grand in San Pedro. And again, if you want to get a discount, 20% for Conservancy members, supporters, friends, LAC 20 Fran. So check that out. As you can see, there's lots to do. We have lots of accolades from people in the audience. Again, thanking both Karie and Etan for being here today, and also everything you guys are doing to help tell stories about LA, people and places, whether it's a cemetery or a National Register historic site that Etan is checking out. There's lots to do. And again, thank you everybody for being here with us today. For putting in all the various links to things that are going on across LA. There's much, which is a good thing. We're blessed in terms of that. And again, thank you all for taking part in this. And for those that are members of the Conservancy, we really appreciate your support and encourage others that aren't yet, please join us so we can do more programming like this and support the work that people like Karie and Etan are doing across LA County. So again, thank you all and enjoy Halloween. Get your costumes ready, get your house decorated, get your candy loaded up, and have a good upcoming holiday weekend. Bye, everyone.